maximize the time that you get to hear from them and eventually speak with them and ask questions of them. It's not on. Ready? Kelly? Yeah. Right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, if you can hear me okay, then while she's figuring that out, I'll get my part over, which is the least important part. Except for thanking you all for being here. We had to postpone this for a week because of weather, and I want to tell you how grateful I am that you're all here. Despite that postponement, I'm grateful to the panel who all showed up again, put this on their busy schedules, and I want to thank you for your interest in this issue. The ACLU has been involved in fighting battles for LGBT rights for decades. Literally, our first battle was in the 1930s. But we recognize that this has been an evolving battle for many people, and it's been one that, for many people, they're where they began, and many people have evolved. And we wish in Indiana that we didn't have to be having this particular battle. As you know, across the country, the issue of marriage equality has come up in many shapes and sizes and forms. Here, we're fighting a defensive battle, trying to off our Constitution. But there's a bright side that's been coming from having this particular battle. As Megan will tell you, as she discusses the Freedom Indiana campaign that's grown from nothing over the last 6 months, Hoosiers have responded in ways that are surprising to everybody. Not just to the country, that the reaction of Hoosiers, writing letters, making phone calls, speaking from their hearts has been incredibly rewarding, and we want to thank everybody who's done that. But our legislators are listening, and the evidence of that has been across the street in the last 6 weeks. That's incredibly gratifying, and that says a lot about Indiana and our ability to change and to open our hearts. So I'm proud of Freedom Indiana. I'm proud of my fellow Hoosiers. I recognize that not everybody across our state is unanimity on this issue, and that's Tully's brilliant article the past week brought that home again, reminded us that we have much work to do, not only on topics like HJR 6, but also in the battles to go, because at least at the ACLU, this is a defensive battle. We want to be fighting offensive battles on this question of fairness and equality. So I want to thank you all for being here. I just want to say a quick word about First Wednesdays. Some of you have been coming to them for years. Traditionally, they've been in Indianapolis. This year, we're sharing the love, and we're taking First Wednesdays on the road, and you can see on the back of your program, the cities are going to have First Wednesday programs and over the course of the year. But I'm sure we'll have opportunities in Indianapolis throughout the year, and so stay tuned, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you. So thank you for being here. I'm going to have the awesome and talented and insightful Matt Tully come and share this discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Is this on now?
Yes.
I've heard I sound a lot smarter when there's no microphone, but we have one. Well, thanks for coming out today, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. I used to moderate the First Wednesday program several years ago. I think it's been 1 or 2 years doing it. I had a lot of fun doing it, and I was happy to come back for a one-time reappearance. Let me just briefly introduce the panel. Their bios are in your programs, and you can read a lot more about them. But on my right, obviously, is the Reverend Richard Hamilton. next to him is Megan Robertson, who has headed the Freedom Indiana program, and on the far right is Rob Smith with Eli Lilly. So maybe give them a hand, and then we'll get to some questions. So I'm going to start with Megan. I don't know if all of you are living and breathing in the State House these days and following every twist and turn about cursive writing and various alcohol sales at the state fair, things like that.
Lots of important things happening there.
Lots of big things happening over there. This is the time of year we all as Hoosiers brace because we have the cold weather and the legislature in session. I think it's time we hope just to survive. But Megan, can you give a update for everyone on where HJR3 is, what the next step is, and what you see happening in the coming weeks?
Sure. So HJR3 used to be called HJR6, which one of my lobbyists told me that they renamed it because it has half the support it used to have, which is good. But it passed through the House, and what they did in the House is they took the second sentence out. So the first sentence is pretty clear-cut, marriage between one man and one woman. The second sentence, they get into a little more detail, saying that any substantially similar legal recognition will not be, recognized in Indiana, which, if anybody can tell me what substantially similar means in a way that will stand up in the courts, I'll buy you a drink after this. But point being, they took the second sentence out in the House and have sent it over to the Senate. The Senate heard it in committee and has not inserted the second sentence back in to HJR3, and tomorrow is when we'll have second reading, which in the State House, that's when they talk about amending the language. So in second reading, we'll find out if they're planning to add the second sentence back in, which would then send it back to the House to approve or disapprove. But it's my sense that tomorrow is really where we'll see the Senate decide not to put the second sentence back in. At least that's our hope. And we'll be watching eagerly tomorrow at 1:30 at the State House is when they'll be discussing that issue.
Megan, I know there's been debate about whether the amendment could go to the voters in November if they only pass the first sentence, because that first sentence will not have passed two legislatures in a row. I know you think it can't go to the voters. Is the legal community unanimous in opinion that that can't go to the voters if there is a change?
I mean, anybody who knows attorneys, I don't think the legal community is going to be unanimous on anything. That's the point. They like to go to court and fight it out. So, and there has been a lot of discussion about how a lot of attorneys are going to make a lot of money off of all of this if they do try to do that. But my sense is, and a lot of other people's sense, including Senator Long, who's one of the people who would have to ratify sending it to the Secretary of State's election division to put it on the ballot, seem to think that you cannot just send the first sentence on its own to go to the ballot. So if we keep the second sentence out, the belief is that we've effectively stopped this from going to the ballot this year, which is a big victory for our campaign. Obviously, we'd love to see the whole thing voted down, and we're not giving up on that option, but something that keeps us from going to the ballot is a victory.
Rob, can you talk about the decision your company made to get involved so actively in this? How rare is that for a large company on a social issue like this, and why was it made?
It's a good question, Matt. Thank you for moderating today. It's rare for companies like ours to get involved in a topic like this that is so inherently controversial. But we became involved in this because we felt like it would impact our business if HJR3 would go forward, particularly going forward with a very divisive public referendum. And the primary argument that we've been making is the fact that we think that HJR3 will impact negatively our ability to recruit, retain, and engage great talent working at our company. And there have been people that have, I think, tried to dismiss that argument, frankly, with some weak argumentation. But I really want to underscore how important we think this is at Lilly, and I know this view is shared by many other businesses and those working at institutions of higher learning, for example. At Lilly, we are working on some of the most intractable diseases humanity knows. We have research teams that are working to find breakthroughs for Alzheimer's, for diabetes, for various forms of cancer. And a lot of these research teams are working right here in Indianapolis. Of our 11,000 Indiana employees, we have 4,500 directly engaged in research and development, including including some of the best scientists in the world. And we have to retain that talent. We have to keep them engaged and motivated. And then as we have people leave our workforce, retire, et cetera, we need to make sure that we're able to replace them with people who are just as good or better. And this war for talent, ladies and gentlemen, is intense. Everybody is battling for this kind of brain power to come and work for their organizations. And we feel very strongly that HJR3 will be an impediment to our ability to recruit and retain this kind of talent working at our company. And I think that this goes beyond just Lilly. We are deeply interested, for example, in having our state to continue its progress in building out a life sciences economy in central Indiana and throughout the state. That's going to require us, not just at Lilly, but companies big and small, our academic institutions like the IU School of Medicine, to be able to attract and retain great talent, scientific research, medical doctors, but also very importantly, entrepreneurs who want to take budding technology and take risks to build new businesses and create new jobs. And things like HJR3 will not help us create the conditions to bring that kind of talent to Indiana. That will hurt not just Lilly, but we think the entire state. And then the last point that I would make in this regard is that this isn't a static or retrospective analysis. We have to project what things will look like going forward. And I think it's a very important point that is worth emphasizing, that the millennial generation in particular reject things like HJR3 by enormous numbers. The millennial generation is a huge generation of Americans. They rival the baby boomers in terms of size. Estimates suggest that they'll make up 75% of the workforce in less than 15 years. They're growing in number in the workforce, and they're growing in influence. And they reject things like HJR3. And we have to ask ourselves, etching this language into our highest legal document, is this the way to be able to attract and retain young professionals to Indiana? We think the answer to that question is no. So for those reasons, at a high level, that's why we decided that we wanted to not just step out and advocate, but we take a leadership position to ensure that we don't etch this language into our state's most important legal document.
Thank you. Reverend Hamilton, the position you've taken on this issue goes counter to what we hear from a lot of religious leaders. Are you an outlier, or is your view more shared than maybe people realize?
Well, I'm glad the question didn't go to the public vote as to whether I could represent all the faith communities. I think I know where I'd come out on that. But I do want to, I'm really pleased to be able to be a part of a panel like this, because the faith community is often identified with positions that only represent a partial group of the faith community. I only represent a part of it. And I'm here in a group that's fairly friendly to the position I'm going to be advocating. But I want to back off for just a moment and put this in a little broader historic perspective. You know, the relationship, when speaking about marriage, the relationship between the civil community on one side as an agency which has stakes in what marriage is, how families grow, and so forth, is over there. On the other side, the faith community, in whatever faith tradition you live in, has been a part of making the same kind of definitions about marriage over here. And these two come together, not always carefully, and not always in an organized way, and not always in consensus at all. So it's no surprise that an issue like the one before our legislature is actually a continuation of a conversation which has been going on literally for centuries. There was a time in England in the middle of the 17th century when one prominent civic voice said, "I wish we could stop that church from meddling in mission, in marriage." And the church, 100 years, less than 100 years later, the church had made the situation change so much that in England one could not be married except in the Church of England. Now, if that's true, we're dealing with a question then that is not amenable to a simple answer. And here in Indiana, those of us in the faith community, which think of marriage in one whole set of categories, meeting with the civic community, which has other interests, other definitions, other patterns, other traditions, it's no surprise that there's some problem. This is a difficult problem. The faith community is obviously not one voice here, but I do want to represent that part of the faith community, which is not a single voice speaking. After all, 8 or 9 leaders of major faith communities in this state made a joint statement within the last several weeks, it's been in the paper, supporting the opposition to HJR 3. And I represent that viewpoint too. Now, coming from a faith community, I am going to acknowledge that the faith community itself is all divided about this. On the other hand, many of us in the faith community recognize that the specific issue before us does not require us to be of one mind with all definitions from a religious standpoint of what marriage is or is not, who can take part in it, what conditions, what age. We were arguing not too many decades ago about whether people across racial lines could marry. That has been pretty well settled. All kinds of differences. But the faith community has to recognize that the particular issue before us is not essentially a faith definition question. It has to do with our role in the civic community. And our role in the civic community ought to say that marriage is a civic contract and that we cannot impose religious ideas about marriage one way or another. So I speak from the standpoint that religions generally often agree that the individual choice in matters of intimacy, in matters of vocational choices, in matters of what health is and is not, the religious community needs to acknowledge that in this issue, we're talking about what is the nature of the public, the civic definition of marriage. There, we ought to be of one voice saying, every individual should have the right to choose his or her life partners and to live out their lives without thereby disengaging themselves from the rights which every other individual should have in making that choice. That's the way I would define this. The religious community can be together in saying individuals before God have their right to choose their life partners. And it's time to recognize that in our law. It's taken us time to come to that in other regards of those two traditions. Now's the time to recognize it in this one.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple rounds of questions, but I want this to be a conversation with you too. So feel free to raise your hand at any point. We'll get a microphone out to you and add your questions to the discussion. Megan, can you talk about the gap that you've seen between support for gay marriage and opposition to HJR3? How wide is that gap?
Well, I mean, I've said it 100 times, but we have a very broad coalition. We have folks from every age range. Yesterday there was some talk that there were younger people coming out against gay marriage and in favor of HJR3, and that's fine. There's some people that do that, but the bottom line is we have folks, whether you're a senior, whether you're 15, whether you're gay, whether you're straight, Republican, Democrat, for gay marriage, against gay marriage, but just think the Constitution, that this isn't something that should be in our Constitution. As long as you're against HJR3, you're with us, one way or another. You're with Team Freedom Indiana. And, obviously we all have our own personal opinions, and even within our coalition, I think we have differences of opinions, or at least differences on how active members of our board will be on certain topics going forward. But what we can all say is that we're against HJR3. Lilly and Cummins are against HCR3 for very different reasons than one another, and so are lots of people in this movement. You know, I do come from the Republican side of the aisle on things, so and I'm actually against HCR3 and am supportive of gay marriage personally. But I've talked to a lot of Republicans who don't necessarily support gay marriage, but think it shouldn't be in our Constitution, and don't think, you know, they think it's kind of an overreach of government to kind of regulate these sorts of things. We had John Costas, he's the mayor up in Valparaiso, Indiana, conservative, evangelical Christian. I went to his church when I was to the same church as him when I was a kid, so I know how conservative he is. But he was one of the people that spoke out against HCR3. And then you have, you know, kind of the other side of it, where you have Mayor McDermott, who's a Democrat from Hammond, all close in the same area, and Mayor McDermott is for marriage equality. So our main message is, as long as you're against HCR3, you're with us one way or another.
What message do you think is impacting the debate most on both sides? Meaning, which of the various arguments that your group has made against HCR3, which one do you think is resonating with average Hoosiers the most? And which message do you think from the other side is resonating the most?
I think from our side of things, you know, we did a poll in the fall, and what we found was that nearly 70% of people think there should be some legal recognition for same-sex couples, whether they think it's marriage or civil unions or domestic partnerships or, you know, hospital visitation, whatever you want to put it in. They think there should be something. Now, the disagreement is on what that actually looks like, but where we've found kind of the most consensus, I think, is the second sentence, and saying that it goes way too far. And not only should this not be in our Constitution, but putting something in the Constitution that says there's no legal recognition. People really don't like that and have a big problem with it. So that's, I think, been our most effective argument. When, I mean, you can talk to almost anybody and they still think that people should be able, when you're sick in the hospital, to have the person that you want visiting you and making decisions for you, to be able to do that without any kind of interference from the government. And so that's been our best argument. I'd say the other side's argument, you know, the best, I mean, honestly, their arguments have not been very good, and it's a good thing that, you know, they don't have great people running their campaign, I would say. But I guess their best argument has been let the people vote, which I think is still a terrible argument, because since when do we vote on other people's rights, and have these kinds of campaigns on rights? But that's been their best argument, I think.
Rob, you talked about, go ahead, Robert.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just feel guilty here because I think a lot of the problem is coming from the religious community, and that comes because of differences which we are not going to resolve during this debate in the religious community. And that's why I'm urging my compatriots, that is, people who come at this with a deep commitment to a religious view of marriage, need to set those aside for now and say this issue should not prevent us from joining in another place where we are together. And that is to say that the individual before God should not be interfered with by governmental processes in such an act as this. They are interfered with now, and HJR would just make that interference more difficult to change in the future. Let's keep that open. We won't solve our differences, but let's get together where we are together.
Rob, you mentioned the challenge of recruiting the workers that your company hopes to recruit. Has the damage already been done?
It's a good question. We have seen damage done. You know, we don't have any sophisticated studies to show statistical proof that this is a problem. But we have a lot of anecdotal information. Our head of human resources testified in both in front of House and Senate committees, sharing very specific examples of people who have left our company, or very talented people who have lived in other states or in other countries who have not wanted to come to Lilly because of what they perceive as an unwelcoming attitude about their relationships. So we have a lot of anecdotes. Interestingly, I have talked to people who are working currently at Lilly who have said if this is put into our Constitution, I won't leave the company. I like my job, but I won't stay here when I retire. Lilly has a long history of retired leaders living in Indianapolis and giving back to the community, serving on boards, giving away money, being very philanthropic. This is sort of an interesting version of brain drain at the other end of the continuum. And these are kinds of things, again, this all feels very self-inflicted to me. And, Matt, your question about has the damage been done, some damage has been done, but let's be very clear. We will do significant damage if this passes the General Assembly and goes to a referendum. It'll be 2014 when many other states are moving in a completely different direction. And we will be engaged in a very high profile, very divisive, very expensive referendum that will generate a lot of national and even international attention about the state of Indiana. And, we have been successful as a company recruiting talent here, obviously by definition. And one of the things, frankly, that works for us is the fact that it may sound trite, but it's this idea of Hoosier hospitality. People come to Indianapolis and they say, wow, there are a lot of things to do. That surprises me, but there are. This is a nice city. And very importantly, people here are nice. This is a great place to raise a family of all kinds. HJR 3, if this goes to a referendum, and the headlines that will be coming out of Indiana will be undermining our very, very much this differentiating trait of Hoosier hospitality. And we think that's a real mistake. So I think if this passes the General Assembly and goes to a referendum, we'll do even greater damage to the reputation of our state and as a place that would welcome young and present talent.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You were was in the lead when the legislature was considering legislation and legislation. Why is your argument not making headway? And why is, you're the leader of the community, your company is the leader of the community, and it just seems like there's a bunch of knuckleheads up there that don't want to listen to common sense. So why are they, what are they saying back to you that makes you feel like you're not reaching them?
It's a very good question. The thing is, I think we are making progress. As Megan talked about, who would have thought even just a few months ago that the House would have taken out the second sentence? I would have put the probability close to zero, frankly, a few months ago that would happen. So I think that our voices are being heard by the General Assembly. I'm hopeful tomorrow that the second sentence won't be inserted by the Senate. And again, this is a makeup in the Senate's 37-13 Republican to Democrat. This passed by enormous margins the last time in the General Assembly. I think it was like 40-10 in the Senate or something like that last time. I think our voices are being heard. It would be nice if we could set this completely aside and focus on more important things like jobs and education. But we just have to keep chipping away at this and making sure that our arguments are being heard. We're ultimately victorious on this. But I do think we've made great progress. And if I don't mind one point of personal privilege, I'm on the board of directors of Freedom Indiana, and a big reason why we are making this kind of progress with the General Assembly is the work of Megan and her amazing leadership and the great team that she's assembled throughout the state. Again, when we were talking about doing this in August, we thought, well, maybe there might be a shot that we could be successful with the General Assembly, but there was a lot of skepticism. But I think through Freedom Indiana and other mechanisms, we're making our collective voices heard, and it's having an impact at the General Assembly. Thank you for the question and for the very long answer.
Reverend Hamilton, first of all, the positions that you hold today, if we went back 25 years, would your positions have been similar, or it was 1996 that the Democratic president was signing the current, the federal law. Have you, to quote another president, have you evolved on this issue, or has this been something that you would have shared in 1984?
Well, I don't think there are many of us of anywhere near my age who have not gone through some transition in thinking about the whole matter of a gender difference that used to be not even spoken about publicly. And for that to have evolved in a social sense is a very rapid change in our society over my lifetime and the lifetime of many of us here. So there has been a change. And yes, I moved in that. I preached a sermon in 1978 in which I did the first public acknowledgement of this issue within the faith community. And even at that time I had to say, no, I'm still working through some of this. So yes, I've changed personally, and other parts of the faith community. This Freedom Indiana group had an event in the church here that I know something about, but it was their event. And on that Sunday afternoon, a couple of weeks ago, I was absolutely astounded at the variety of religious voices that were there speaking across all expectations. Pentecostal church group there, African American church group there, Muslims there, Jewish voices there, Catholic, Protestants of all description were there because they were drawn by the action of this mobilizing force we've had. So yes, we've changed, and I see that as good. But I want to say again, we don't have to resolve all those religious differences. Let's get together where we are together in saying individuals have a right to their personal freedom, if in anything, in the most personal and most intimate of human relationships, to say that person, those persons must not be shut off from the benefits of life choices they make for partnership.
Megan, obviously here in Indianapolis, we pay a lot of, I always consider the State House kind of like another city hall for us on steroids. You know, we pay a lot of attention to what goes on in state government because we're right here. Once you get outside of a pretty narrow geographic area, amazingly people don't pay that close of attention to what's going on at the State House. As I've traveled the state, I found, one, people might not have heard of this debate, or if they have, they know just a little, they think maybe the state's debating legalizing gay marriage, or not a whole lot of high information voters right now on this issue. What are you finding outside of central Indiana on this issue? And if this does go to the voters, I mean, how do you sell your message to small towns and other areas that maybe are inclined to support this?
Well, I think first off, it depends a lot on who you're talking to. I mean, I know you were talking about Shelbyville, how you had some conversations there. I've had lots of conversations with folks in Shelbyville, and it really just depends on if you're talking to somebody who pays attention to local politics or not, to whether they're going to know what's going on at the State House and know that no, we're not trying to legalize gay marriage. Although that is, I guess I should add that in as one of the effective messages from the other side, because it can be so confusing. I don't think that they're necessarily out there telling people, well, they're not trying to legalize gay marriage. I think they want to make people think that's what we're doing, actually. So maybe that is an effective message they've gotten through. But I think it depends on where you're talking about. We have been very strategic in where we have organized. We have, I don't have unlimited resources, and so we have spent a lot of time in the districts with legislators that we felt had a more open mind or might be more willing to listen to their constituents based on their track record. Dan Leonard is a guy, he's from Huntington, Indiana, owns a furniture store there, he was named Legislator of the Year back in 2006, and is a guy that is very open to discussion. We have been organizing in his district since probably, gosh, I want to say, early in the fall, I'd say probably September, October. We had a field staffer there. They were working, identifying folks, having people talk to him, whether it was folks from his church or people that he just knew within the Republican Party or just in politics in general, and having them have conversations with them. And so I think if you go in Huntington, a lot of people understand what's going on. I think if you go to a place like where Eric Turner is from, which actually he's from sort of central Indiana, so more people would know. But when it was folks that we knew were lockstep with the other side of this, we weren't going to waste a lot of resources on them. So the education in the community was done in a much different way. So I guess, I think it depends on where you are in the state, who you're talking to. I think it's not necessarily defined by small towns or large towns, because a lot of our support, I mean, Dan Leonard is the reason why, Ryan Bosma says anyway, the reason that it wouldn't have passed through judiciary, and they had to do all of the commotion of changing the committees, because Dan Leonard and Wendy McNamara from Evansville were folks who said, we're not really comfortable with this as is. And Wendy's from Evansville, so she voted to take the second sentence out. So I don't think it has to do with whether you're north or south or a small city or a big city, but really more the legislator and how we were able to work with them.
Rob, to look at the other side of the issue you've talked about here, has there been a backlash from the position you've taken, either with some of your employees or legislature or the community in general?
It's a good question, and we have had a bit of criticism for the position that we've taken, and we're most sensitive to our employees, because there are many employees that we have in our company that have some concerns about the position that we've taken. It's not a large number, but there are people who are deeply concerned. We've also received correspondence from customers around the country concerned about the position that we've taken. And that's why we wanted to make sure before we took such a position that we felt really good that this was in our best business interest to do so. And again, for the reasons I stated earlier, we think that this is enormously problematic for our long-term prospects as a company and as a state. So we try to handle those criticisms, Matt, in a thoughtful and very respectful way. I've spent personal time talking on the phone with employees, listening to their concerns. And one of the things that I try to tell them that, one of the primary reasons we're taking a position on this is our commitment to diversity and respect for people. And that goes both ways. People that have very strong views inside our organization about the stand we've taken. People like me, I owe it to them to listen and to better explain why we took the position we've done. So we've had some criticism. It's not overwhelming by any stretch of the imagination. We've had really inside the company and elsewhere overwhelming support for what we've done. But for those who have voiced very legitimate, thoughtful criticisms, we've tried to listen and even better explain why we've taken the position we've taken.
Let's open it to some questions. We have a microphone here. If you can kind of keep the questions as tightly worded as possible, because we're down to just a few minutes.
Yes, I'm Nancy Pappas, and I don't know how many legislative members are supporting the amendment because they can't find their way spiritually or biblically to vote the other way. I happen to attend a former church of Reverend Hamilton, St. Luke's United Methodist Church, and our pastor's wife has been leading a session on homosexuality in the Bible, and she used a couple of resources that I found immensely helpful, one of which is online for anybody here who wants to understand better how to answer questions that are raised by folks who have biblical objections. You can go online for a documentary called The Bible Tells Me So, and they used to charge for it, but now it's free. You can find it online. And there is a study guide that goes with it that's been put together by a United Methodist Church in Dallas, Texas, of all places, and several religious scholars have put it together. There is a charge for the study guide, but we did in a 6-week session. I thought I would, check out each chapter for the 6 weeks. When I picked it up, I could not put it down. It was fascinating. And the bottom line of all of it was the Old Testament had an awful lot of rules. You couldn't wear 2 types of clothing at the same time. You couldn't plant 2 types of seed in the same field. And the New Testament says, forget all the old rules. There are only 2 that matter, to love God and to love each other. And I don't think we ought to be passing a constitutional amendment that tries to outlaw love.
Thank you. Any other questions out there?
Thank you.
Those 2 right there.
Like Barbara that preceded me, it's more a comment. I'm a lifelong educator, and when I step back and kind of reflect on my 32 years as a Boucher, I think there's been tremendous progress, and I attribute that to people that are sitting at the table, as well as probably every single individual in this room who has at some point decided, despite the odds, I'm going to do what I perceive to be the right thing, and I'm going to speak up. And for that, I thank Lilly, Cummins, president of Indiana University, my former employer. There are any number of business and educational institutions and now professional organizations, as well as clergy. And I quite agree with Reverend Hamilton that this, I think, which Barbara just testified to, is a slippery slope with the current legislation, because if we go in that direction, I think we're playing into the card that this becomes a religious issue instead of a public issue in the civil society in which we live, and we really have to keep that separated. And to some extent, as an educator, I think key to the progress that's occurred in the past 7 or 8 months is because of tremendous effort to educate so that those young people that are representing freedom to marry, I think is what they call themselves, and there was a very young woman who identified herself as legal counsel.
We only have 5 minutes for questions.
Okay. But at any rate, she testified to what you said is the dividing line that they've currently adopted, which is let the people vote. Sounds great as a soundbite, but when you look at the numbers of things that constitutionally we've not had the right to vote on very many things, we've elected representatives to represent the public good. And so I think there's a lot of evidence of progress on this and other divisive issues.
Thank you. I think the gentleman here.
Megan, a question for you. I'm hearing about a law that will take effect July 1st that will make it a Class 6 felony for a member of the clergy to solemnize any marriage that is illegal in the state of Indiana, such as bigamy, polygamy, which were the ostensible reasons. The underlying reason, of course, was to prevent and attach a criminal penalty to clergy people performing same-gender marriages. Am I hearing that right?
That's a really good question, and do you know anything about it?
You're suggesting that there is such a proposed law in the state level here?
It is, from what I've heard, it has passed and takes effect July 1st.
I'm not aware of that.
I can help a little bit here. I think some opponents of the law have argued that. I honestly don't know what the answer is, but if you're asking where that's coming from, I think that's being, that message has been shared in certain churches around the state from the opponents as far as the details of the legislation. I know we had a story on it, and I think that I can't remember what the details of the story. I have a 3-year-old, so I'll blame that on no sleep. But if you give me your email, I can get you the story. I think we have time for one more good question. Yeah. Yeah.
So I got a question about that, and I don't know if that's a lot. I can tell you that if it were, I can imagine that the ACLU would be suing somebody ASAP. So I suspect that it may have they're taking something out of context and using it to scare ministers.
That's what I would say too.
But the ACLU would be the first to defend those ministers' rights to do whatever ritual they want to do inside the church government.
I have just a quick question, and that is, right now, one of the things that is being said to people to convince them that they should not be voting for this is that we do not want to put this into the Constitution, because after all, we already have a law that that does not accept same-sex marriage. And I think it's nice to use this as a tool to say, well, we don't need it in the Constitution because politically it might be effective. But right now in Indiana, we're facing a number of problems because the ones who have been married someplace, who are legally married, get all of the federal rights. And this even leads to, for example, someone who is filing taxes. It's very difficult. They file married, married at the federal level, and then we try to figure out how do you do it at the state level where they cannot do it. And the problem of putting in social security number twice, getting kicked out, I mean, the difficulties are great. So I'm just wondering,
Megan, do you have any comments?
can we deal with that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I think kind of the overall, I'm just gonna say here thinking kind of the overall message of this whole thing is that, you know, to make big things happen and impact big change, it takes time, and we're not gonna get it all right overnight. You know, in a lot of states, they are recognizing if you would be filing federally as a married couple, then you can locally in your state. Our state is not doing that. One of the many things that we need to fix here in Indiana. But, you know, I would just say we don't want to be complacent and say that we need to be patient, but at the same time, we do have to be a little bit patient because we're not going to get it all done in 6 months, which is how long Freedom Indiana's been around. So,
I think we have one last question.
My name is Alan Ray Davidson. I happen to be one of the candidates for the United States House of Representatives for the 5th Congressional District, and I have come here to expressly state my opposition to HJR 3. I believe it is wrong for the government to tell one person, a man, for instance, that he can marry if he marries a woman, but not if he chooses to marry a man. This is not a decision that the government should be making, federal, state, or local levels.
Thank you very much. I think we have time. I've been told I won't get my pay if I don't get shot by 12:50. I'm joking, I'm not getting paid. So I would offer each panelist maybe 35 seconds to make a eloquent closing statement. I'll start with the Reverend.
Well, I want to thank people who've raised other questions. I want to say I'm glad St. Luke's are having Bible studies that illuminate some of this. I've been in Bible studies for all my life, and it takes a while, so we're not going to get that done by tomorrow, and they have to make the decision. And I would simply say, help your friends in other religious communities to understand that this is not essentially trying to resolve religious differences. It's saying this is a civil issue on which we ought to be together to support the individual right of individual citizens to make the most private conclusions and decisions they have a right to make, and to have those rights extended to them.
well, I guess I would just jump in and say, first off, thanks for being here today. Obviously, you're folks who have been involved in the process for a long time, and tomorrow is an opportunity to be involved in the process. We're going to be gathering at the State House. Freedom Indiana will be organizing. Everybody wears red, except for me, because I'm superstitious, and we seem to lose votes when I'm wearing red, so I won't be wearing red. I will not wear red, but I'm with you in spirit. So come tomorrow, 12:30. The session will start about 1:30, and you can be a part of what I think is going to be a historic day. And again, it's a small step, but for the overall movement, but a very big step for us here in Indiana.
You know, Senator Long wore a red tie on Monday. Is that
Well, he did wear one. Oddly enough, Eric Miller wore one a couple of weeks ago. The first day, he didn't know we were wearing red, which he's one of the big leaders of the opposition. I enjoyed that immensely.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll just quickly close and say that, you know, Indiana has a lot of opportunities and challenges. We still have high rates of unemployment and underemployment. We have large percentages of our population that are undereducated, given the kinds of jobs that are going to be created in the 21st century. We have real challenges, and we need to get serious about addressing those. And HJR 3 is an enormous distraction from that very important work. And we'd be better off to set that aside and focus on more important topics. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Before you leave, we promised you guys a t-shirt. I'll let the Reverend pick the winner.
We know you won't.